Commander Zethkar of the Galactic Defense Fleet had seen many strange things during his 40-cycle career. Three-headed beasts from Proxima 7. Crystal entities that fed on stellar radiation. Even the notorious void swimmers of the Andromeda sector. But nothing had prepared him for his first encounter with humans and their bizarre collection of companion animals. The human delegation had arrived at Orbital Station Kepler 3 rotations ago, bringing with them a menagerie that defied all logic. Dogs that served no apparent military function yet followed orders with disturbing precision. Horses too large for ship corridors but somehow deemed essential for morale. And strangest of all, small furry creatures called cats that seemed to do absolutely nothing except sleep, eat, and stare at things that weren't there. "I don't understand it," muttered Science Officer Veltar, adjusting her chitinous headpiece as she watched the human quarters through the observation deck. Every other species brings their warriors, their weapons, their tools. Humans bring pets. Below them, in the human quarters, a small orange tabby cat named Whiskers was doing exactly what Veltar described. Absolutely nothing of apparent value. The cat lay sprawled across a warm console, occasionally twitching an ear or opening one emerald eye to assess whether the approaching footsteps belonged to someone worth acknowledging. They did not. Captain Sarah Chen stepped over Whiskers without breaking stride, a gesture so casual it made the watching aliens flinch. In their cultures, stepping over a living being was either a grave insult or a declaration of dominance. But the cat merely purred louder and shifted to claim more of the warmth radiating from the console. "The human-animal relationship makes no sense," Zethkar observed, his forearms crossing in a gesture of confusion. "The creatures contribute nothing to survival, yet humans dedicate resources to their care. They speak to them as if expecting answers. They even modify their living spaces to accommodate these parasites. They, creators, prove them." This last word came out with particular distaste. Zethkar's own species, the Krathari, had eliminated all non-essential life forms from their ships millennia ago. Every organism aboard a Krathari vessel served a specific function: food production, waste processing, atmospheric regulation. The concept of keeping a creature purely for emotional satisfaction was not just foreign. It was wasteful to the point of being offensive. The humans had tried to explain, of course. During the integration briefings, Captain Chen had spoken at length about companionship and stress relief and something called emotional support. The translator programs had struggled with these concepts, rendering them in ways that made even less sense to the assembled alien commanders. "They claim these animals provide psychological benefits," Veltar recalled, reading from her notes. "Something about unconditional love and comfort during difficult times. The medical implications are unclear." "Weakness," declared War Prime Thux from his position near the viewport. The massive Urgashi warrior rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried the weight of a species that had conquered 17 star systems through sheer military might. Humans depend on these creatures because they cannot find strength within themselves. When crisis comes, this dependency will be their downfall. The other alien officers nodded in agreement. It was a common sentiment throughout the station. Humans were curiosities, technologically capable, surprisingly innovative, but ultimately flawed by their emotional attachments to useless creatures. The dogs, at least, showed some promise as attack animals, though they seemed far too friendly and undisciplined for serious combat. But the cats? They were mysteries wrapped in fur, contributing nothing while demanding everything. Dr. Sarah Chen's aide, a young engineer named Marcus, had attempted to demonstrate a cat's utility the previous rotation. He'd brought his black and white cat, Pixel, to the engineering deck and tried to show how the animal could detect problems with electronics by investigating unusual sounds or thermal signatures. The demonstration had been a disaster. Pixel had shown more interest in a ball of discarded wire than in the deliberately sabotaged atmospheric processor, and had fallen asleep halfway through Marcus's explanation. "Perhaps," suggested Veltar diplomatically, "we are simply too different to understand. Human evolution took a path that included these symbiotic relationships. Our species developed differently. And well, Zethkar's mandibles clicked in disagreement. Symbiosis implies mutual benefit. What benefit do humans receive from a creature that sleeps 18 hours per planetary rotation and exists solely to consume resources? None of the assembled aliens had an answer. They'd observed the humans for rotations now, documenting their routines, their technologies, their social structures. The humans were undoubtedly intelligent. Their FTL drive technology was actually superior to the galactic standard in several key areas. Their military tactics showed impressive adaptability. Their diplomatic protocols were sophisticated and respectful. But then they would do something completely inexplicable, like the incident 2 rotations ago, when Captain Chen had delayed a crucial supply run because her cat had looked lonely and needed extra attention, or when Lieutenant Rodriguez had requested modified quarters because his dog needed room to run. The idea that military decisions could be influenced by the perceived emotional needs of non-sentient creatures was baffling. "There's something else," Veltar added, consulting her tablet. "Intelligence reports from other first contact scenarios suggest this behavior is universal among humans. Every ship, every station, every colony we've encountered, they all maintain these animal companions. It's not cultural or regional. It appears to be species-wide behavior." This information caused a stir among the assembled officers. Species-wide traits were typically survival mechanisms, evolved responses that provided clear evolutionary advantages. But if every human population maintained these seemingly useless creatures, there had to be something they weren't understanding. "We should investigate further," Zethkar decided. "Schedule additional observation periods. Document all interactions between humans and their animals. Perhaps there are benefits we cannot detect with our instruments." As if on cue, an alarm began to sound throughout the station. All heads turned toward the emergency communication panel as a priority message crackled to life. "All stations. This is Deep Space Monitor 7. We have detected an unidentified contact on approach vector. Classification unknown. Estimated arrival in 6 rotations." Arnie, Zethkar's expression darkened. Unknown contacts in this region could mean only one thing. The entity they'd been tracking for months might have finally found them. The thing that had already consumed 3 research stations and defied every attempt at classification or communication. Down in the human quarters, Whiskers suddenly sat up, ears pricked forward, staring intently at something none of the humans could see. The thing that emerged from hyperspace 6 hours later defied every classification system in the galactic database. It wasn't a ship. Sensors detected no metal, no energy signatures consistent with known technology. It wasn't organic either. Its surface showed none of the thermal patterns or electromagnetic fields associated with living tissue. What it was, according to the increasingly frantic readings from Science Officer Veltar's instruments, was impossible. "It's approximately 200 meters in length," she reported, her voice maintaining professional calm despite the tremor in her secondary arms. "Mass readings are inconsistent. Sometimes it registers as having the density of neutronium, other times it barely registers at all. Its surface appears to shift between solid matter and something resembling condensed shadow." Commander Zethkar studied the main viewer, watching the entity drift toward their station with movements that seemed both purposeful and randomly chaotic. Sometimes it moved in straight lines that suggested intelligence. Other times it tumbled and writhed like something caught in a stellar wind. The most disturbing aspect was how it seemed to bend light around itself, creating patches of absolute darkness that hurt to look at directly. "Defensive systems report ready," announced War Prime Thux, but his usual confidence was noticeably absent. "However, our weapons may prove ineffective. Similar entities have demonstrated resistance to both energy and projectile weapons." This was the fear that had haunted the Galactic Defense Fleet for months. 3 research stations had encountered entities like this one. 3 research stations had simply stopped transmitting. When rescue ships arrived, they found nothing but empty space, where sprawling research facilities had once orbited their respective stars. No debris, no energy signatures, No clues about what had happened to thousands of crew members and their installations. The only evidence came from partial transmissions. Fragments of panicked communications that cut off mid-sentence. Weapons that passed harmlessly through the entities. Shields that provided no protection. And always, at the end, the same inexplicable detail. Crew members reporting that their equipment was going crazy moments before all contact was lost. "Sir," called Communications Officer Blixtar from her station. "The entity has stopped moving. Distance: 50,000 kilometers and holding position." On the main screen, the impossible thing had indeed stopped its approach. It hung in space like a wound in reality, occasionally pulsing with colors that had no names in any known language. Around its edges, space itself seemed to ripple and distort, as if the entity's mere presence was too much for the universe to comfortably contain. "Scanning protocols are yielding contradictory data," Veltar reported. "Every instrument gives different readings. It's as if the entity exists in multiple states, simultaneously." Meanwhile, throughout the station, something strange was happening among the human quarters. Every cat aboard had stopped their usual activities. No more napping in warm corners. No more grooming or playful swatting at dust motes. Instead, they sat in perfect stillness, all facing the same direction, toward the entity floating in space beyond the station's hull. Captain Chen noticed it first when she entered her quarters to retrieve emergency protocols from her personal files. Whiskers, who normally greeted her return with elaborate displays of feline indifference, was sitting bolt upright on the observation port's ledge, staring into space with an intensity she'd never seen before. "What's gotten into you?" she asked, but Whiskers didn't acknowledge her presence. The cat's pupils were fully dilated despite the bright cabin lighting, and every muscle in his small body was tense with anticipation. Down the corridor, Engineer Marcus found his cat Pixel in an identical position. Lieutenant Rodriguez discovered his tabby, Cosmos, doing the same thing. Throughout the human sections of the station, every feline had assumed the same posture: alert, focused, and utterly still. The humans, busy with emergency preparations, barely noticed. They had protocols to follow, systems to check, defensive positions to coordinate with their alien colleagues. The strange behavior of their pets was filed under "deal with later," as more pressing concerns demanded their attention. But in the alien sections of the station, sensors began registering anomalous readings. Equipment that had functioned perfectly for decades started producing impossible data. Navigation computers reported their position as simultaneously being in 17 different star systems. Life support systems detected atmospheric compositions that violated basic chemistry. Communications equipment picked up signals from frequencies that didn't exist. "The entity is affecting our technology," Veltar announced, her voice rising with the first notes of panic. "It's not using any kind of interference pattern we recognize. Our instruments aren't being blocked, they're being fed false information. Or possibly true information that shouldn't be possible." War Prime Thux moved to his tactical console and found displays that made him question his own sanity. According to his weapons systems, the entity was simultaneously 1 kilometer away and at the far edge of the galaxy. His targeting computers couldn't achieve lock-on because they couldn't agree on what they were supposed to lock onto. Even more disturbing, his tactical database was suggesting attack strategies against creatures that had never existed, using weapons that had never been invented. "This is how they do it," Zethkar realized, his 4 arms gripping the command chair as understanding dawned. "They don't destroy stations with conventional force. They corrupt our ability to perceive reality. Our crews don't disappear. They lose the capacity to distinguish between what's real and what isn't. They probably destroyed themselves trying to fight hallucinations." The entity pulsed again, and new impossible readings flooded their systems. Gravitational sensors detected 14 different gravity wells in the same location. Thermal imaging showed temperatures ranging from absolute zero to the interior of a star, all occupying the same space. Even the chronometers began displaying contradictory times, as if the entity's presence was somehow affecting the flow of time itself. But while the alien technology descended into chaos, something interesting was happening in the human quarters. Their equipment, identical in design and function to the alien systems, was experiencing the same impossible readings. But the humans themselves seemed less affected by the contradictory information. Must be some kind of sensory attack, Captain Chen muttered, as she worked around displays that claimed her coffee cup was both empty and full, while simultaneously being a small star. Trying to overload our processing capabilities. Her casual dismissal of the impossible readings was noted by Zethkar through the internal monitoring systems, where his crew was becoming increasingly agitated by the contradictory data. The humans simply ignored what didn't make sense and focused on what did. How are they maintaining functionality? He wondered aloud. Their instruments are as compromised as ours. Veltar checked her readings again, noting how human vital signs remained relatively stable compared to the alien crew members, who were showing increasing signs of stress and disorientation. Perhaps their mental architecture is different, less dependent on technological verification of reality. It was a logical hypothesis. But it didn't explain the cats. Every feline on the station had now moved to positions where they could see the entity directly. They sat motionless, watching, as if they were seeing something the sophisticated sensor arrays couldn't detect. On the bridge, alarms began sounding as more systems fell prey to the entity's influence. Navigation reported they were flying backward through time. Life support claimed the air was composed entirely of liquid mercury. Shields registered both full power and complete failure. And still the entity hung there, pulsing with impossible colors, waiting for something. In her quarters, Whiskers suddenly stood up, stretched in the particular way cats do before action, and padded silently toward the door. When it didn't open immediately, he sat down and began to make a sound Captain Chen had never heard before. A low, thrumming vibration that seemed to resonate through the station's hull. Throughout the human quarters, every cat began making the same sound. The thrumming sound from the cats grew louder, vibrating through the station's superstructure in a frequency that seemed to cut through the chaos of malfunctioning equipment. On the bridge, Commander Zethkar watched his instruments spiral further into impossibility while trying to formulate some kind of response to the entity's assault on their reality. "Sir," Communications Officer Blixtar called out, her voice strained. "I'm detecting massive energy buildup from the entity. Whatever it's been doing to our systems, it's preparing for the next phase." Through the main viewer, the entity began to change. What had been shifting shadows and impossible geometries now started to solidify into something that triggered primal fear responses in every species aboard the station. It was becoming visible, not just as sensor readings or distorted light, but as an actual presence that their evolved brains could finally process. What they saw defied description in any language the universal translators could handle. It was hunger given form, emptiness with intent, the space between thoughts made manifest and angry. Worst of all, it was looking directly at them with senses that existed in dimensions their minds couldn't fully grasp. All stations report increasing system failures. "War Prime," Thux announced, his massive frame betraying the first signs of genuine fear. "Weapons systems are registering targets that don't exist while failing to detect the actual threat. I cannot guarantee our ability to defend the station." In the human quarters, the cat's thrumming had evolved into something else entirely. It was still recognizable as a feline sound, but deeper, more complex, as if each small throat was producing harmonics that resonated with fundamental forces of the universe. The humans, focused on their emergency protocols, were just beginning to notice how calm their pets had become. Captain Chen paused in her equipment checks to observe Whiskers, who had moved to the center of her quarters and was now sitting in a perfect sphinx position, eyes fixed on something beyond the walls. The thrumming sound he produced seemed to make the air itself more stable, as if his small voice was somehow arguing with the chaos outside. "That's new," she murmured. But before she could investigate further, the station's emergency lighting activated, and Commander Zethkar's voice echoed through all sections. "All personnel to emergency stations. The entity has begun active approach. Estimated contact in 30 seconds. Through the viewports, the impossible thing was moving again, but now its movement had purpose and direction. It flowed through space like liquid nightmare, growing larger as it approached. More disturbing still, their sensors could finally agree on what they were seeing. And what they were seeing was something that had emerged from the spaces between dimensions, bringing with it the absolute certainty of the station's destruction. Distance 5,000 kilometers and closing, Veltar reported. All defensive systems show ready, but based on previous encounters. She didn't finish the sentence. Everyone knew how those previous encounters had ended. Contact in 10 seconds, came the update. On the main screen, the entity filled their view, a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to drink light and possibility. It reached toward the station with appendages that existed in too many dimensions to count, and space around them began to fracture like broken glass. 5 seconds to contact. That's when Whiskers moved. The small orange tabby rose from his sphinx position, took 2 steps toward the nearest wall, and opened his mouth to release a sound that had never before emerged from any cat in known galactic history. It wasn't quite a yowl, wasn't quite a hiss, wasn't quite anything that could be categorized by xenobiology textbooks. What it was, however, was absolutely certain and utterly dismissive. The sound lasted exactly 3 seconds. For the first second, it was pure rejection. The kind of sound a cat makes when confronted with something that has no right to exist in its territory. For the second second, it became something else entirely. A harmonic frequency that seemed to resonate with the fundamental structure of reality itself. For the third second, it was a command issued with the authority of a species that had spent millennia as apex predators. Despite weighing 8 pounds, the entity stopped, not slowed down, not hesitated. Stopped completely, as if it had run into an invisible wall constructed from pure feline disdain. Throughout the station, every cat was now making the same sound, their small voices joining in a chorus that somehow managed to be both barely audible and overwhelmingly powerful. The thrumming had become a declaration, and the declaration was simple. No, not here. This place is claimed. On the bridge, instruments that had been reporting impossible data for hours suddenly cleared. Navigation systems locked onto their actual position. Life support reported normal atmospheric composition. Weapon systems achieved perfect targeting solutions on the now motionless entity. What? Commander Zethkar began, but couldn't finish the question. Through the main viewer, the entity was changing again. The writhing darkness was condensing, compacting, becoming smaller and somehow more defined. Whatever process had allowed it to exist in multiple dimensional states simultaneously was being constrained, forced into a single configuration that made sense to normal physics. The cats, Science Officer Veltar whispered, checking her readings with growing amazement. They're producing a resonance frequency that's somehow stabilizing local space-time. The entity can't maintain its impossible existence in the presence of their certainty. It was impossible to explain in scientific terms, but the evidence was undeniable. Every feline aboard the station was contributing to a harmonic pattern that simply refused to allow impossibility to exist in their vicinity. They were treating the entity the same way they treated any other unwelcome presence in their territory, with absolute conviction that it had no right to be there. The entity, now compressed into a form that actually made sense to their sensors, was revealed to be far smaller than it had appeared, perhaps 20 meters in length, with a crystalline structure that pulsed with frustrated energy. Deprived of its ability to exist in multiple states simultaneously, it was just another space creature, albeit one with unusual properties. Target acquired, War Prime Thux announced with renewed confidence. Weapons locked. Fire, ordered Zethkar. The station's defensive batteries spoke once. The entity, constrained to normal dimensional parameters by the continued certainty of the cats, couldn't phase shift to avoid the blast. It simply ceased to exist. Reduced to component atoms by weapons that had been useless against it only moments before, silence fell over the bridge, broken only by the diminishing thrums from the human quarters as the cats, satisfied that the threat had been dealt with, began returning to their usual activities of sleeping, eating, and ignoring everyone around them. Threat neutralized, Veltar reported unnecessarily. Her instruments were back to normal, reporting nothing more exotic than the usual background radiation of space. Commander Zethkar stood slowly, his forearms trembling slightly as he processed what had just occurred. A threat that had destroyed 3 research stations, defied the combined military might of the Galactic Defense Fleet, and challenged the very nature of reality itself, had been defeated by what amounted to a collective expression of feline disapproval. "Science officer," he said quietly. "I want a full analysis of what just happened. Priority 1. Classification." "Already on it, sir," Veltar replied, her own voice filled with new respect. "Preliminary readings suggest the cats were somehow able to impose local reality stability through harmonic resonance. It's as if they instinctively understood that the entity's power came from existing in multiple quantum states, and simply refused to allow that." In her quarters, Captain Chen was kneeling next to Whiskers, who had returned to his favorite spot on the warm console, and was grooming his paw with the same casual indifference he showed to everything else. She scratched behind his ears, receiving a purr that sounded perfectly normal. No interdimensional harmonics, no reality-stabilizing frequencies, just the contented sound of a small predator who was pleased with his territory. "You knew, didn't you?" she said softly. "Somehow you all knew exactly what that thing was and how to deal with it." Whiskers paused in his grooming long enough to give her the look cats reserved for particularly slow humans, then returned to his paw with obvious satisfaction. Later, as reports flowed in from across the station, a new understanding began to emerge among the alien crew members. The cats hadn't been useless passengers, they had been guardians. Creatures evolved to recognize and eliminate threats that existed outside normal perception. While sophisticated sensor arrays and advanced weapons had been helpless against an entity that refused to follow the rules of physics, the simple certainty of territorial predators had been exactly what was needed. "We were wrong," Commander Zethkar admitted during the post-incident briefing. "We assumed that because we couldn't understand the human-animal relationship, it served no practical purpose. We failed to consider that evolution doesn't preserve useless traits." War Prime Thux, still somewhat stunned by the turn of events, nodded slowly. "Perhaps these pets are not signs of human weakness, but evidence of their strength. They have formed alliances with creatures capable of defending against threats we cannot even properly perceive." Science Officer Veltar was already composing reports that would fundamentally change how the Galactic Defense Fleet approached unknown entities. "Request permission to invite human feline consultants to all first contact scenarios involving anomalous phenomena," she suggested. "Granted," Zethkar replied immediately. "And Veltar? Make sure our xenobiology databases reflect new classifications for Earth felines. They're not pets, they're—" He paused, searching for the right term. "Reality enforcement officers." Throughout the station, cats continued their usual activities of sleeping 18 hours per day and existing solely to consume resources. But now, when they occasionally stared at empty spaces or investigated sounds only they could hear, the alien crew members watched with new understanding. They were on duty.